morning. We want to tell a short story about a man who was actually the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Rockford, Illinois. And Rockford, Illinois is not far from us, 2 hours that way. And he was the pastor of that kind of historic church, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. If you go to Rockford, you can find a pretty impressive statue of this man. It is a statue memorializing him as a significant person in the city's history. But what's interesting about this, if you want to see that statue, you have to go to the Unitarian Church to see it. And the Unitarian Church in Rockford, Illinois is a blasphemous, evil place. And so it is here that the statue of this man who was the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Rockford is prominently placed, for it's here, I think, that he is most appreciated, and we're going to tell his story this morning. Why would a man who was a Baptist pastor be memorialized in a Unitarian church, especially this one? And the answer to that question is something that the apostles warned us about in Scripture throughout the book of Acts. Paul warns Timothy in the book of Timothy. John warns us in his books about false teachers that can spring up even among us. And it wouldn't be important if the Bible didn't mention it. And so it is important for us to maybe hear this story of Dr. Thomas Kerr. Dr. Thomas Kerr was a medical doctor. He was born in Scotland. He was a Scottish immigrant to America. And in Scotland, he received his medical training at the University of Scotland. From all accounts, was a brilliant man, brilliant doctor. He came to America. He went to the University of Iowa State University, and received another degree. He began to study philosophy, and that interested him. And then he turned his attention to theology, and he was very interested in theology, and studied that for about 7 years. We don't know much more about his life up to that point, but as I said, from all accounts, was a man very, very, very intelligent. And in 1860, the First Baptist Church of Rockford, Illinois, called him to be their pastor. From all accounts, he was very appreciated there. The church grew, but he, in those 6 years that he was there at first, he began to expand his horizons, and he became very interested in something that was brand new, some brand new writings. In 1859, just a couple of years before this, Charles Darwin had written his Origin of the Species. And Darwin was not new to the theory of evolution. This was just how he published it at that time. He had written many essays and maybe short books on a similar subject. And Dr. Kerr began to study Darwin and thought that, he could broaden his horizons. He could maybe help get some arguments to be able to, argue against those evolutionists. And in 1866, he told his church that he was going to resign and he was going to follow another path and go to Missouri and study. I'm not sure what exactly he did in Missouri, but I think he continued his education. So in 1866, he did. He resigned the First Baptist Church in Rockford and went to Missouri. Well, for a while, the church kind of struggled, couldn't find a pastor. And the one thing they knew was they really missed his brilliant messages. And so they as a church voted to recall Dr. Kerr to become back and be pastor. And for 3 years they did that. And finally, after 3 years, he agreed, and he came back and became pastor again in 1869 of the First Baptist Church of Rockford. However, as the Rockford newspaper put it, and they loved this. They were not saying this as a criticism, but they said that he had begun to outgrow his environment, And I think that we wouldn't agree with that writing. They said he was open-minded and began to preach a softer, kinder gospel. And so the people of the church actually figured this out pretty quickly. And in just a few months, they asked him to resign. On August 28, 1870, Dr. Kerr preached his resignation message right there in the First Baptist Church of Rockford. Unfortunately, he left the church, but unfortunately took 48 members with him, and they began what would become the first Unitarian church in Rockford. One of the writings that they put out was that they contained that the doctrine or the creed of the church contained no fundamental dogmas or stated creed. And Dr. Kerr's story was memorialized in a pamphlet that the Unitarian Church was very proud of, because to them it represented the triumph of humanism over historic Christianity, and they had won that battle. They said he was a worshiper of facts, and isn't it ironic that he sold his soul for a lie? But anyway, that's his story, and I'm reminded of about 100 years before that, another pastor, evangelist, George Whitefield, he made the clergy of his day furious by suggesting that some of them, if not many of them, they were professionals, but they probably weren't even saved. And the clergy it inflamed the clergy there in George Whitefield's day. And so it's possible, even among our churches, that wolves can rise up in our congregation and begin teaching false doctrine. And again, if it wasn't so, the apostles wouldn't have warned us about it throughout the New Testament. So it's an interesting story. Paul urges Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:16. He says, "Take heed unto thyself and unto the doctrine, continue in them. For in doing this thou shalt both save thyself and them that hear thee." So it was a difficult day for the First Baptist Church of Rockford, the day that they, in a sense, the community held up Dr. Kerr as an open-minded pastor. And of course, the First Baptist Church was a very difficult day for them. But they survived. The First Baptist Church of Rockford, to this day, continues to preach the gospel. It's 175 years old now, and that's a testimony to God and the Scripture and that church. And so, just an interesting story, kind of maybe not a happy story, but a story that's good for us to hear and understand that there can be this rise up among us, and we have to stay grounded in the Scripture, and as the apostles warned us, as the Bible warns us. So let's take that story to heart and understand what happened this day in Baptist history in 1870.